at which they are made. Dating Burnham's various writings as accurately as can be done from internal evidence, and then noting what events they coincided with, we find the following relationships. In The Managerial Revolution, Burnham prophesizes a German victory, postponement of the Russo-German War until after Britain is defeated, and, subsequently, the defeat of Russia. The book, or much of it, was written in the second half of 1940, i.e. at a time when the Germans had overrun Western Europe and were bombing Britain, and the Russians were collaborating with them fairly closely, in what appeared, at any rate, to be a spirit of appeasement. In the supplementary note added to the English edition of the book, Burnham appears to assume that the USSR is already beaten and the splitting up process is about to begin. This was published in the spring of 1942 and presumably written at the end of 1941, i.e. when the Germans were in the suburbs of Moscow. The prediction that Russia would gang up with Japan against the USA was written early in 1944, soon after the conclusion of the new Russo-Japanese Treaty. The prophecy of Russian world conquest was written in the winter of 1944, when the Russians were advancing rapidly in Eastern Europe, while the Western Allies were still held up in Italy and northern France. It will be seen that at each point Burnham is predicting a continuation of the thing that is happening. Now, the tendency to do this is not simply a bad habit, like inaccuracy or exaggeration, which one can correct by taking thought. It is a major mental disease, and its roots lie partly in cowardice and partly in the worship of power, which is not fully separable from cowardice. Suppose in 1940 you had taken a Gallup poll in England on the question, will Germany win the war? You would have found, curiously enough, that the group answering yes contained a far higher percentage of intelligent people with IQs of over 120, shall we say, than the group answering no. The same would have held good in the middle of 1942. In this case, the figures would not have been so striking, but if you had made the question, will the Germans capture Alexandria, or will the Japanese be able to hold on to the territories they have captured, then once again there would have been a very marked tendency for intelligence to concentrate in the yes group. In every case, the less gifted person would have been likelier to give a right answer. If one went simply by these instances, one might assume that high intelligence and bad military judgment always go together. However, it is not so simple as that. The English intelligentsia, on the whole, were more defeatist than the mass of the people, and some of them went on being defeatist at a time when the war was quite plainly won, because they were better able to visualize the dreary years of warfare that lay ahead. Their morale was worse, because their imaginations were stronger. The quickest way of ending a war is to lose it, and if one finds the prospect of a long war intolerable, it is natural to disbelieve in the possibility of victory. But there was more to it than that. There was also the disaffection of large numbers of intellectuals, which made it difficult for them not to side with any country hostile to Britain. And the deepest of all, there was admiration, though only in a very few cases conscious admiration, for the power, energy, and cruelty of the Nazi regime. It would be a useful though tedious labor to go through the left-wing press and enumerate all the hostile references to Nazism during the years 1935 to 45. One would find, I have little doubt, that they reached their high water mark in 1937-38 and 1944-45, and dropped off noticeably in the years 1939-42. That is, during the period when Germany seemed to be winning. One would find also the same people advocating a compromise peace in 1940 and approving the dismemberment of Germany in 1945. And if one studied the reactions of the English intelligentsia towards the USSR, there, too, one would find genuinely progressive impulses mixed up with admiration for power and cruelty. It would be grossly unfair to suggest that power worship is the only motive for Russophile feeling, but it is one motive, and among intellectuals it is probably the strongest one. Power worship blurs political judgment because it leads, almost unavoidably, to the belief that present trends will continue. Whoever is winning at the moment will always seem to be invincible. If the Japanese have conquered South Asia, then they will keep South Asia forever. If the Germans have conquered Tobruk, they will infallibly capture Cairo. If the Russians are in Berlin, it will not be long before they are in London, and so on. This habit of mind leads also to the belief that things will happen more quickly, completely, and catastrophically than they ever do in practice. The rise and fall of empires, the disappearance of cultures and religions, are expected to happen with earthquake suddenness, and processes which have barely started are talked about as though they were already at an end. Burnham's writings are full of apocalyptic visions. Nations, governments, classes, and social systems are constantly described as expanding, contracting, decaying, dissolving, toppling, crashing, crumbling, crystallizing, and, in general, behaving in an unstable and melodramatic way. The slowness of historical change, the fact that any epoch always contains a great deal of the last epoch, is never sufficiently allowed for. Such a manner of thinking is bound to lead to mistaken prophecies because, even when it gauges the direction of events rightly, it will miscalculate their tempo. Within the space of 5 years, Burnham foretold the domination of Russia by Germany and of Germany by Russia. In each case, he was obeying the same instinct, the instinct to bow down before the conqueror of the moment, to accept the existing trend as irreversible. With this in mind, one can criticize his theory in a broader way. The mistakes I have pointed out do not disprove Burnham's theory, but they do cast light on his probable reasons for holding it. In this connection, one cannot leave out of account the fact that Burnham is an American. Every political theory has a certain regional tinge about it, and every nation, every culture, has its own characteristic prejudices and patches of ignorance. There are certain problems that must almost inevitably be seen in a different perspective according to the geographical situation from which one is looking at them. Now, the attitude that Burnham adopts of classifying communism and fascism as much the same thing, and at the same time accepting both of them, or at any rate, not assuming that either must be violently struggled against, is essentially an American attitude, and would be almost impossible for an Englishman or any other Western European. English writers who consider communism and fascism to be the same thing invariably hold that both are monstrous evils which must be fought to the death. On the other hand, any Englishman who believes communism and fascism to be opposites will feel that he ought to side with one or the other. The reason for this difference of outlook is simple enough and, as usual, is bound up with wish thinking. If totalitarianism triumphs and the dreams of the geopoliticians come true, Britain will disappear as a world power, and the whole of Western Europe will be swallowed by some single great state. This is not a prospect that is easy for an Englishman to contemplate with detachment. Either he does not want Britain to disappear, in which case he will tend to construct theories proving the thing that he wants, or like a minority of intellectuals, he will decide that his country is finished and transfer his allegiance to some foreign power. An American does not have to make the same choice. Whatever happens, the United States will survive as a great power, and from the American point of view, it does not make much difference whether Europe is dominated by Russia or by Germany. Most Americans who think of the matter at all would prefer to see the world divided between 2 or 3 monster states, which had reached their natural boundaries and could bargain with one another on economic issues without being troubled by ideological differences. Such a world picture fits in with the American tendency to admire size for its own sake and to feel that success constitutes justification, and it fits in with the all-prevailing anti-British sentiment. In practice, Britain and the United States have twice been forced into an alliance against Germany, and will probably, before long, be forced into alliance against Russia. But subjectively, a majority of Americans would prefer either Russia or Germany to Britain, and, as between Russia and Germany, would prefer whichever seems stronger at the moment. It is, therefore, not surprising that Burnham's worldview should often be noticeably close to that of the American imperialists on the one side, or to that of the isolationists on the other. It is a quote-unquote tough, or quote-unquote realistic worldview, which fits in with the American form of wish-thinking. The almost open admiration for Nazi methods, which Burnham shows in the earlier of his 2 books, and which would seem shocking to almost any English reader, depends ultimately on the fact that the Atlantic is wider than the Channel. As I have said earlier, Burnham has probably been more right than wrong about the present and the immediate past. For quite 50 years past, the general drift has almost certainly been towards oligarchy. The ever-increasing concentration of industrial and financial power, the diminishing importance of the individual capitalist or shareholder, and the growth of the new quote-unquote managerial class of scientists, technicians, and bureaucrats, the weakness of the proletariat against the centralized state, the increasing helplessness of small countries against big ones, the decay of representative institutions, and the appearance of one-party regimes based on police terrorism, faked plebiscites, etc., all these things seem to point in the same direction. Burnham sees the trend and assumes that it is irresistible, rather as a rabbit fascinated by a boa constrictor might assume that a boa constrictor is the strongest thing in the world. When one looks a little deeper, one sees that all his ideas rest upon two axioms which are taken for granted in the earlier book and made partly explicit in the second one. They are that A, politics is essentially the same in all ages, and that B, political behavior is different from other kinds of behavior. To take the second point first, in the Machiavellians, Burnham insists that politics is simply the struggle for power. Every great social movement, every war, every revolution, every political program, however edifying and utopian, really has behind it the ambitions of some sectional group which is out to grab power for itself. Power can never be restrained by any ethical or religious code, but only by other power. The nearest possible approach to altruistic behavior is the